All right. Hi, everyone. This is Pastor Adam and
Pastor Bob.
we decided we were going to try to do a kind of a Bible study, not a Bible study, but a study. Yeah, it's going to include the Bible, I hope, about fear. And we thought that it'd be interesting if you could hear from both of us. So we're going to watch a video from Adam Hamilton. He wrote a book called Unafraid a couple of years ago, and this is a video series that they're going to discuss some of this stuff. And as they're discussing, if Pastor Bob or I want to chime in and, say a little thing or be quirky or, make a bad joke, then we're going to do that too. And we'll see how this goes. All right. You ready, Pastor?
I am.
Here we go. Black screens are so interesting.
It's a good video.
Yeah, you like it? Why is it not playing? Go. There we go. He's got a good name, that Adam Hamilton.
Hi, my name is Adam Hamilton. I'm the senior pastor at the United Methodist Church of the Resurrection, and I'm the author of Unafraid, Living with Courage and Hope in Uncertain Times. And I want to thank you for inviting us to be a part of this conversation with you. I've got some great guests who are going to be joining me for these conversations and joining us for these conversations. And I wonder if you'd each just say a word about yourselves.
Thank you for the invitation. My name is Carlos Rosa. I grew up in the Methodist Church in Mexico City. Somehow I ended up in this great country, and through trying to jump in different locations, God brought me back to work in the church. And so today I'm serving as an elder in the United Methodist Church.
My name is Marie King. I've been bivocational for a number of years. I'm a registered nurse. I'm also a faith community nurse, and I'm also an ordained clergy with the United Methodist Church in Deacon.
And I'm Ginger Rothfuss, and I just finished seminary in May, and am currently serving as a care minister at our Resurrection Downtown campus, and I write and teach classes for our women's ministry at our Leawood campus. And I too am second career. I was a business consultant in my first life.
Well, I am so delighted that all three of you are here as conversation partners with me, and this is a really important topic that we're covering. As we begin talking about fear, everyone struggles with fear. I've traveled around the world. No matter where I've gone, I ask people, do you wrestle with fear? What does fear look like for you? And I've yet to find a person who says, no, I never struggle with worry or anxiety or panic or fear. I mean, we all wrestle with these things. And so it's such a universal concern. And it was in listening to and hearing people talk about their fears that I thought, it'd be good to really spend some time researching this, studying this, first as a pastor to help the congregation that I serve, and then for a broader audience to really talk about how do we deal with fear? How do we overcome fear? How do we live with courage in the face of our fears? And so that's what we're going to talk about today. And I'd like to begin by recognizing that, in our lives, fear is hardwired into us. So it's not that there's something defective in us and therefore we fear. It's actually a gift from God, that God has created us and our brains with the capacity to protect ourselves. And so on the one hand, fear is a really good gift because it helps us detect when there's a danger or a threat. It leads us to respond accordingly. And that's a mechanism that really protects and saves us. Not just us, but all creatures. They have these defensive mechanisms. The challenge, of course, is that we have a tendency to fear things that maybe we don't need to be afraid of, or we exaggerate the threat. And then we find our brain starts telling our body to be prepared to fight or flee or to freeze. And in the process of doing that, we find that we're actually overcome by things that we shouldn't be afraid of. And so the aim of the study is really to help us be able to overcome our fears with courage and hope, and to look to see how our faith might play a role in that as well. So we're going to look to see, what have the psychologists taught us? What are the experts teaching, ordinary people? What do the therapists do when you come in and you're overwhelmed with anxiety or fear? But then we're also going to look to see, how does our faith play some role in that? And all three of you are deeply committed Christians. You are seminary trained. So we're going to look to see both how you do this in your own life, how you do this in other people's lives. And we're going to talk about various kinds of fears that we face as a society, as individuals.
All right, I'm going to pause just for a second right there. So I think it's interesting that we do get, some of the language that he's using here is like, we do get overwhelmed with our fears, right? And it kind of shuts down our rational minds. Absolutely true. But I also think it's interesting the word that we can overcome our fears. And I'm not sure that that's always true or what we want. I think at least maybe ultimately we want to overcome our fears, but before we do that, we want to learn from them. We
Right.
don't want to push them away. We want to actually figure out what's going on here, because our fears are, as you already said, are a good thing. They're kind of like built into us.
Right.
And so of course they're there to teach us something first, not to shut us down. Right.
Right. Yeah, I get the overcoming fear. I found, yeah, a little not awkward, but not exactly what I would have said, because there are some very rational fears that overcoming doesn't really make sense, right?
Right.
So
Like, I'm
yeah,
afraid of getting hit by a bus. I should never overcome that fear. Right.
right,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
And so I'm assuming, because we are just watching this, that hopefully that's not what he's obviously talking about, is that overcoming means that we are rid of the fear, in a or whatever. But how do we in a sense walk with the fear instead?
Right. Maybe
So
even welcome it as something
yeah,
that's a good in our lives, and that in that way it doesn't overwhelm us, and then we are not overcome by our fear, and that's
right,
what I
right.
love to see happen.
Yeah.
What's the Brene Brown quote that you shared with me the other day? What does she say?
She was talking about Amazing Grace, right?
Right.
And she said, what was it?
Well, there's that line,
Your grace taught my heart to fear.
grace taught my heart to fear.
Yeah, and I'd never. She said it like, how did she put? She was. You'd have to. We should play that video.
I can't do it.
Yeah. She was talking about how how grace allows her to be afraid.
Yes.
So grace allows her to know that she can fear. And it's more that sense of being able to walk with your fear or in your fear to continue. And she talked about how, and the thing that I found so so freeing, I think, about what she said about fear, was that she's never done anything, or she said something like the most important things she's ever done have been in some way born out of fear, or have caused her to, be truly afraid.
Yeah.
But being able, that the grace of God has allowed her, and I think, I can probably say the same thing. The grace of God has allowed me to, know that that I've done this before. I've lived in fear and walked through fear before.
Right.
And that's what grace maybe has done. So not being overcome, but recognizing that in my fear, even God walks through that with me.
Yeah. And I think that for me, when I heard that phrase, that grace taught my heart to fear, it's not like grace causes the fear, but it's like I can be graceful to myself and others when they are afraid. That's exactly how we should be in those moments, especially in moments like this where
Right.
people are all kinds, and fear causes all those different kinds of reactions in us. It's be graceful. It's real. We're going to get through it, but fear isn't necessarily overcome and just eliminated. It's an opportunity for us as Christians to show grace, to be there for them.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. All right, should we keep going?
Yes.
All right, here we go.
So some of our fears are very deeply personal. Some of them are fears for what's happening in our society or our world, or fear of other people. And over the next 5 weeks, we're going to explore each of these kinds of fears and see how our faith and how common sense and the wisdom of experts might help us overcome our fears. So I'm really excited that you're going to help us in that conversation together. And I guess I'd like to begin by remembering a story in Scripture where the Israelites have been set free from slavery. I have a chapter in the book on paralyzed by fear, a mile from the promised land. And the Israelites, who have just been set free from slavery in Egypt, are now at the edge of the promised land. 2 years in, they were right a mile from the promised land. They send the spies into the promised land, and 2 of them come back and say after 40 days, "Oh, it's awesome, we can do it. God is going to help us." And 10 of them say, "We can't do it. We look like grasshoppers, and these people in the land look like giants." And tragically, they spent 38 years paralyzed by fear, a mile from the promised land. So I'd like to begin with that point, and just to ask the question: how do you see, and how have you personally experienced fear either paralyzing you in life or the people that you know or care about? How have you wrestled with fear in your lives?
All right, we got to pause there. People spending 38 years in fear, a mile or whatever he said from the promised land. It's brilliant, right? And of course, that's what we do. So we're not only are we afraid in this moment, which is why this series is important, because we need to talk about fear in the midst of the virus, but we have been living lives of fear, and it's become so normal that that's just what we think life is, that we be afraid, right? And it's like they never got the full liberation. They got out, and then they never got to many of them never got to the promised land. It was the next generation that got to the promised land.
Well, yeah, I mean, I was, every time I think about fear, I always talk about, I used to watch this TV show. It was like, I don't know, an FBI show, and I don't know why I watched it, but it was about missing persons, right?
Right.
And I'd watch it, and with a show like that, everything has to keep getting worse and worse and worse.
Right. Otherwise, it doesn't keep your attention.
They have to just keep ramping it up. So of course, at some point, they got to a point where it was like every other episode, there was a kid who was like kidnapped, and then something horrible, right? Or something horrible was going to happen if they didn't find this person in 48 hours or something. And I remember I would watch it, and then that whole evening I would sleep horribly. I would have horrible dreams. And I would then take my kids to like playgrounds and stuff. And I'd be like super vigilant because someone was certainly going to take my kid and do horrible things to them, right?
Sure.
So whenever I think about fear, I think about that because it was fear that it was irrational. It was a completely irrational fear. And actually what I ended up doing, or what ended up happening, was I came upon some sort of report. It was probably some news report about actual statistics of violent crimes, and in particular of kids being kidnapped, right?
Yeah.
And the reality was that when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, there were more child abductions than there were when my kids were growing up, and than there are today. And so it was this irrational fear that made me look around and distrust everyone around me, that I was also feeding into because of the things that I was consuming or the things that I was watching. And that's, I really think, kind of it was an interesting thing for me to kind of consider as I kind of look at, what do I fear? And is the fear real? And how am I feeding it?
Yeah. And I think that the last line I really like. I mean, how am I continuing to feed my fear, especially if it's become my lifestyle to just simply be afraid of whatever it is out there.
Right.
I love that. And then, of course, listening to reality, listening to truth rather than your own internal dialogue that is just probably irrational, just spinning scenarios in your head. What do they call it in AA? Like stinking thinking. That's, So, right? And then, so I hope that we continue to figure out how to confront this fear.
Right.
Keep going?
Yeah.
Right.
I think that there's an element of with fear is that we want others to understand the severity of it. In my experience, I've always wanted to have, like, I want you to understand what I'm going through and how I'm feeling. And I feel like that is a little internal battle that we face, that often we need to set aside and trying to deal with the root of what's causing the fear. Absolutely.
I think for me, I felt a year away from the promised land. On my third year in seminary, I was so close to graduating, and 3/4 of the way through, and was really struggling with calling. And for me, it was a fear of being in front of people, a fear of speaking for God, a fear of preaching and influencing people. And I didn't want to mess anyone up. And I took it as a huge responsibility to be a pastor. And so I almost quit seminary because of fear. And then I had to kind of reframe it. My prayer life became, God, how would you have me use this seminary education? Because I'm not seeing myself fit in this box that my friends are pursuing. Is there a different way that I could reach graduation or the promised land? And for me, it became writing. And it became that I would, instead of public speaking, it was public writing. And I still am fearful when I hit that blog post send button. But it turned into writing classes. It turned into a different kind of public speaking. So I almost gave up, paralyzed by fear, but then needed God to help me reframe it to get to the promised land.
That's really good. So how about you, Marie? Were there any fears that you've had since you were a kid? Maybe something you grew up fearing?
I have a great fear of dogs. Ever since I was a little girl, I have always feared dogs. People say dogs won't bite, but dogs will. They have teeth, they will bite. So I've been afraid of dogs all my life. I've tried to do things to alleviate that fear. And when my friends have their dogs around, I try to get closer, taking steps towards alleviating that. And for the community that I was serving, I was able to have an animal blessing one year. And I didn't lay hands on, but I did get close.
That's good. That's excellent. Think about how many times we've been afraid of things.
Go for it.
Well, I just wanted to talk about, you know, I know that, like, I've watched this video before, and I remember thinking about the fears that they were sharing, kind of like, oh, come on, you know, right? And especially at this time, right now, where we have this big kind of
we have a pandemic on our hands.
Yes, and it's a shared fear that we all have, and we're all fearing it in different ways.
And we're not really worried about whether you're afraid of dogs or not. Although
I'm not afraid of dogs. I don't want to touch them.
Right. Yeah.
Kidding, all you animal lovers.
Or even my own fear of, like, I'm afraid of snakes. Fine, but like in the midst of the global pandemic right now.
But also, I just think of my the real fears that, you know, and I'm not saying the fears that they're talking about aren't real, but the fears that I have, those deep fears that actually keep me, you know, and I'm not talking the woman who was graduating from seminary. I don't want to speak for her, but, because I can't. But I remember when I was close to graduation, it was a deeper from seminary or from college or from any kind of transition. It's more than just it's a deeper fear than just. I think there's something deeper, you know.
I think.
I don't know.
Let me piggyback on that, because for me, it's not whether I'm going to screw it up, because I know I'm going to screw up some of the ways. I'm going to fail at it. I do it all the time. It's the taking on of a new identity in the community. Is this really who I am?
Yep.
And when she used the call language, she kind of said, well, I don't know if I can public speak. That's not the issue. I mean, I'm sure she's a fine speaker right now.
Right.
The issue is this really who God is asking me to be for these people and love them in this way? Right. And if so, then I can go for it. And if not, I'm afraid of messing that up, because I don't want to hurt other people, or I don't want to lead a community that I'm not supposed to be leading.
Right. Yeah.
Maybe it's a deep identity fear. Is this who I am?
Yeah. The other thing, though, that actually, when I was taking some time and not being like, oh, those aren't that big of fears, especially in the, what I heard the first guy.
Bob's a little snarky, just so you didn't.
Yeah, right. I can be. Sorry. But the first guy who was talking, he was talking about the fear, or in a sense of what helps fear is being listened to. Yes. Right. Which I thought was really, really interesting. And then the second woman, who I wish I remembered these people's names. She talked about the need to listen for, right? Because that's what she talked about. What helped her through her fear was listening for what God had to say. Yes. So I thought that was really kind of an interesting, I thought that was interesting that that's what I heard this time, was that and I realized, oh, that does actually help me through my fear, is when somebody actually takes the time to seriously listen to me, but also when I take the time to listen for what is being said to me. So for me, it's what is being said by God through prayer, or what is being said to, what is to be listening for what other people are saying or how they're dealing with that fear. Or, like I use the example of being afraid that my kids were going to be kidnapped,
Right.
listening for what was the actual, like, what are the actual facts? What's the truth in the midst of this? And then, and also listening, for my own experience. But that idea of listening, I picked up on this time as I was.
Because listening almost slows us down from that. When fear hits, instinct also seems to take over.
Yeah.
And listening, and instead of instinct taking over, saying, wait a second, stop, let's listen to this, almost allows you to then to react in a different way.
Right.
I like it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Ready?
Yeah.
In our lives, and we fret about them, we worry about them, we stress about them. And 140 times in Scripture we read this idea. God says, don't be afraid, or Jesus says, don't be afraid, or people are told, don't be afraid, because God is with you. And I wonder what role your faith plays when you're afraid, and how do you access that? How do you come to feel that reassurance?
I got to stop for just 1 second, because this is where we can get into trouble. Really quick, when Scripture says don't be afraid, it's a reassurance. It's not a command or a judgment on you if you are afraid. It's like saying, don't be sick. Well, we're going to get sick, right? But there's a reassurance in the midst of our illness that God is there, that God is the healer. And it's not a judgment on you or your faith if you get sick. It's not a judgment on you or your faith if you are afraid of something. It's just that we also have access to different ways of being afraid because we're faithful people. Like Grace teaches us how to be afraid. You with me on that?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thanks.
It's that courage from your faith.
I think for me, it's a deep breath and recognizing God's presence. It's a pause. My faith is based on, I know God is with me, and a presence to tap into always. And it's not about doctrine or dogma as much as, God, we're in this together. Get me through this moment. Or I surrender it to you. And that's where my faith in I'm not alone, I think, is really my foundation.
For me, it's been first presenting my concerns to God and praying about whatever the assignment is before I accept it. And that empowers me. I know that I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. So reminding myself that God is there with me and present with me is part of the structure of my faith that gets me through.
I love that. I want to wrap up this conversation together by talking about facing your fears. I mentioned in the book my daughter, Danielle, who said while she was in college at Kansas State, she decided to take a skydiving class. She joined the skydiving club. And as a father who tried very carefully to protect my baby her whole life, I was glad she didn't tell me in advance she'd done this. But, we're at lunch and she's telling me, it's like, what? What were you thinking? You jumped out of an airplane voluntarily? What? And I said, why did you do this? And she said, I knew that I have a tendency towards being afraid. And I thought, if I did the scariest thing I could think of and I survived, I wouldn't be afraid anymore. And I have this wonderful picture of her, and it's a little blurry. It was taken, right after she got down on the ground. She's got this huge smile on her face. It's like she had just overcome the world and overcome all of her fears in one moment. And so that idea of facing your fears and overcoming them, what therapists call exposure therapy. I wonder if there's any way that you've done that too that you might want to share.
When I was in my second career, cooking in the kitchen, on my second day at my job, I was kind of working one of the areas that didn't require being close to the fire or going through the high-paced work. And the sous chef have gone through a situation. He started getting sick, and I was called up to say, "You're up." And I didn't know much about the recipes or the things, just the process. I think for me it was the fear of knowing the process. It didn't mean that I didn't feel fear, but in that moment I just had to go for it and just jump right at it. And I burned myself a couple of times, but at the end it wasn't that bad. And I think it kind of allowed me to keep moving forward in that area. So
I think that's what we discovered when we face our fears with faith. is we find it's not usually as bad as we think it's going to be. And then suddenly we find a new courage and strength. Well, I want to thank you for sharing your insights and your fears and being willing to talk about those things here. And this is going to be a great 5-week study. Thank you so much for being a part of it.
Okay, he's about to transition. That's a cool screenshot right there.
That is great.
I like that. So the story about his daughter going skydiving is like, I get it as a parent, you want to protect your kid. I think that deep down, one of my biggest fears in all of that is that I would not live the life that I really could live.
Right.
And would be true for my kids, like that they would somehow be holding back. Like, if you want to go skydiving, I get that it's a scary thing, and it would be a scary thing for me as a dad. But at the same time, don't hold back what you could do in this life. And
right.
You know, you don't want to see people stunted. I think that's a bigger fear for me than anything, that I wouldn't live the kind of life I really could.
Yeah, the thing again that I was kind of, as he was telling the story, that I was pushing back on, though, was the idea that this one event could cure you of fear, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that's what he's saying, but I don't want people to believe that there's this one thing that then we're no longer afraid, you know? Right. I mean, you would, because, you know, again, you would think that people crossing the sea, you know, Moses putting his staff in and, you know, parting the sea and the people crossing through, if anything could cure you of fear, it would be doing something like that, you know?
Right.
But yet they travel and then they get to the promised land and they're still afraid.
Still afraid. I know. They've overcome the sea and then they're afraid of giants. I mean, it's like,
right.
Why? Yeah.
But I look at, and I hear what you're saying, because, you know, so I'm about to turn 50.
He's an old man.
Who knew that could happen, but it can. And so kind of looking back on my life, you know, has been happening, of course, because I don't know, for some reason we've made 50 significant.
Uh-huh.
And you know, what's for me, what's frustrating is I've done some really cool things in my life, right?
Yeah. Right.
But what I have really kind of been looking at are the things that I haven't done, you know, especially like with my family or things like that. And I've realized that it's all out of this fear that you're talking about, that I haven't done some of the things that I wish I would have done more of, you know?
Right.
Yeah. And what those fears are, you know, you kind of look at yourself and you're like, you're an adult and you're still afraid of whatever, you know, like you're afraid that people are going to think you're stupid, or you're afraid that people are going to think you're ridiculous, or,
right. Yeah.
You know, and I've done some things that, you know, you would think, okay, well, you should be confident now because you've done that thing, right? Mm-hmm. So, but yet, man, I still go back and I'm still afraid of the giants, like you said.
Right.
So
pretty much what you're saying is we never fully get rid of our fear. We just maybe should learn how to handle it. Because it's like I'm afraid of, you know, even in the days to come, what church is going to look like. I have no idea.
Yeah.
But you and I have been working in the church for decades, right? And it's like, and we've been innovating on the fly, and it's been kind of fun, but who knows what tomorrow brings. And you could be totally afraid of that. But at the same time, how much has God led us in the past, right? Through all the crazy stuff that we've done in our individual churches, right? And
right.
Of course, we'll be okay going forward, right?
Right.
And yet I'm still afraid. There's still giants out there.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, what's next? Let's see.
In each of our sessions, we're going to have an expert interview, and I'm really excited about our first expert. He is Dr. David Zold. He's professor of psychology and psychiatry at Vanderbilt University. And there, as a neuroscientist, he studies the brain, and he's going to help us understand how the brain works, and in particular, the connection between the brain and fear. Dr. Zold, thank you very much. I appreciate you joining us today.
Happy to be here.
Thank
Don't
you.
shake hands.
Tell us a little bit about fear and the brain. Why do we fear, and what role does the brain play in fear?
Yeah, so there is just a key role here for fear, because if we don't have it, we probably die.
Right.
And if you just think of the range of threats that we have every day we go outside, you know, you can get hit by a car, something, you can fall down, you can injure yourself. You have to learn how to avoid those injuries. And the way we do that as mammals is that we develop fear. So we have to have fear. It's in some ways essential for us as a species.
Yeah. Tell us about the anatomy of fear. What's going on in the brain, and how does it work?
There are some specific brain regions that we really pay attention to when we're thinking about fear. One of them, which you mentioned in your book, is the amygdala. And this is a small almond-shaped area that's in your temporal lobes. It's deep in there. It's in many ways an old structure in terms of its development in mammals. And this ends up being not the only area involved in fear, but it's really essential because it's at sort of the nexus, it's at the intersection of a whole range of motor, attentional, cognitive, and physiological responses. And it's those physiological responses, though, that we often are most aware of. Our heart beating, going boom, 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 or feeling like we're breathing hard, or even having like we can't breathe, having our hands get clammy. All these physiological responses can get triggered by the amygdala to give you that immediate knowledge, that physical knowledge that something's wrong. It both cues you to that, it also is preparing you for what actions you might need to take. For instance, you know, you may be in a situation where what you need to do is run and run as fast as you can. And what it's doing is setting you up to be able to do that, so that you're attending to what you need to attend
Can't
to,
run fast or
and
far
that you're
anymore.
making that the priority.
What?
I said, I cannot run fast or far anymore, no matter
Right,
what my
you're
brain
done.
tells me.
You're turning 50, so fear is not going to help you in this. Yeah, I hear you. Well, since we're paused, what's funny is even when he was describing your heart starting to beat and your hands getting clammy and all that, like I'm like, oh yeah, my hands are clammy now. Like even just talking about fear can make those physiological responses happen in you. So, yeah.
And then you're able to take whatever action it is you need to get safe again.
So fear clearly is a gift. I mean, it's a blessing to us that we have this capacity to do this. Where does it go wrong then? Because there's a lot of us out there who struggle with fear, and it's not over something that might harm us. We just find ourselves paralyzed by fear or overcome by fear. So what are the ways in which you can overcome that, or you treat that?
So there are a few different ways. One of the biggest is to get the person actually doing the very thing they're anxious about. I once worked with a patient who was afraid to hold a knife. And the fear was that if she had that knife, that she might hurt someone with it. But by never holding that knife, she never learns that she can do it. And you say, well, what do you think is going to happen? Well, I might stab you. Okay, let's say you're not going to stab me. What else? Well, I might go crazy. You know, okay, well, let's just test that. Let's actually test whether you can do this for a few minutes without going crazy. Once she learned that, then she could go another step and then another step. And that really ends up being an essential part of any attempt to get fear and anxiety under control.
Excellent. How about worry? Worry is another form of fear that doesn't seem quite so serious as anxiety, and yet there's a whole host of people, in fact, a large number of people in our society carry a measure of worry with them. How does that play into fear and the brain physiology, and how do you overcome that?
When we're talking about the worry, it's often that it can get stuck on. It's not bad for us to worry about some things. The problem is when it gets stuck. And one of the ideas that's out there in the literature is that there's certain parts of the brain where we get loops, where one part of the brain projects to another part, and then that projects to another area, which projects back to the original one.
Interesting.
And so we often think that these loops can get into sort of a feedback mode, where once it starts, it's just circling around, like when you have a guitar, electric guitar, and you start feeding back your guitar against an amplifier. Well, this same sort of circuitry can get going in a person, and then it can be really a challenge to turn it off. And in fact, a lot of what has to be done in working with people who have that sort of chronic worry is getting them to learn some techniques for being able to channel it differently.
Dr. Zoll, this has been a wonderful.
So he doesn't go into what those techniques are.
No.
Yeah.
Maybe that's to come.
Right.
God, I hope so.
Let's hope so, because it's like a song that gets stuck in your head, right? And
Right.
you're like, I can't get rid of it. I can't stop singing this song. And worry is the same way. That's what he's talking about. Worry in general is not necessarily a bad thing, but when you get stuck in that rut and you can't get out of that worry, and you need something to break you out. So I know that, like, you know, for the song that's stuck in your head, you actually have to sing the song out loud, you know, and then
Really?
yeah, and then you can get out of it. So I think that there's something to circle back to the whole listening to your fear, or having someone else listen to your fear and your worry. As long as you keep internalizing it, you're going to get stuck in that rut. But if you share it with somebody, or journal it down, or pray it to God, say it, get it out. You literally get it out of you.
Right.
I think that helps. Not to say that it's going to cure every single rut, because we certainly can get stuck in ruts, but I think that's a first step, right? So.
Yeah. Well, I mean, when he was even talking about the woman with the knife, right?
Right.
Which, you know, that was a fear, not a worry necessarily, but I think they're connected. What was interesting was that woman needed someone there to walk her through it. It wasn't something that she was going to be able to do on her own.
Right.
She was not going to ever pick up a knife and take these little steps toward being able to use a knife.
Right.
And basically what you're saying is kind of the same thing, is in order for us to kind of walk out of our worry, we need somebody to walk with us, you know, somebody who will help us, you know, listen to us, listen to our fear, listen to our worry, so that we can get it, you know, get it out of our head, or get it out of the way, or whatever it is. So
I like it.
So yeah.
Imagine that, like, maybe the church could do that. I wonder.
I don't know, man.
That we would be there for each other. All right, we're almost done. We got 22 seconds left.
22 seconds. I thought it was a weird place to stop.
Don't shake hands.
I want to say that this is the end of our first session. We've got a great journey ahead of us as we're studying how we can live unafraid, not without fear altogether, but how we can live unafraid with courage and hope. I look forward to seeing you next week.
All right, that one's done. Let's get rid of the screen. There we are. All right.
Okay.
All right. Well, that was kind of fun.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think we'll edit this video a little bit and then put it out. See what people think.
Yeah. You know, the kind of the questions though that I've written down is, who do you have that will listen to you?
Nice.
Who are you able to listen to, and what are you listening for?
Nice. Yeah.
So those are my kind of end questions as we kind of close this time, is you know, so
are you can you write those down? And then in that last one, what are you listening for? Are you meaning, like, are we listening to voices that feed our fear, or what do you mean by that?
Well, like the woman was talking about, how I like that I keep referring to her as the woman, the white woman.
Yeah.
When she was talking about how in the midst of her fear, she needed to pause. She talked about pausing a couple of times, but she needed to take her time and really listen for what God was calling her to do and be. And I also think in some ways, maybe the other question is what are we listening to? So do we have someone who will listen to us? What are we listening to? And what are we listening for? You know, those are some, I think, good questions to be asking ourselves. If I'm just feeding my loop, you know, if I'm listening to the things that are feeding my fears, how am I helping myself and those around me, really,
Right.
Because and I'm gonna, I know, but like when I was talking about my kids, I at times, like, there were moments where I was becoming like ridiculous
Sure. Yep.
about where are they? And I mean, there's some of that fear is real, but some of it was just, it was ridiculous,
Yeah. Yeah, because you need to have an appropriate fear that
Yeah.
you're in charge of caring for your kids.
I mean, I don't want my children to get hurt, but and I don't want them to be, I don't want some strange dude,
Yeah.
come in and, but also, they as children, they need freedom, they don't need me constantly. And so I needed to listen to something else.
Right.
And I needed to listen for something else. And here was the thing. And I don't, again, I don't want to belabor this point. I needed to listen to the facts. I needed to hear another story.
Mm-hmm.
And the true story, the factual story, is that fewer kids are abducted today than they were when I was a kid.
Right.
So that was one thing. And then I needed to listen for what God was telling me. And I needed to be reminded that everybody is created in God's image, and that each of us is a child of God, and that also God was telling me, the story God wanted to remind me of is that I have met more people in my life who have been good to me than who have been bad.
Right.
I have met more people in my life who have in some way wanted to help me out, or wanted. I've never met a person who has walked up to me and like killed me.
Not yet. Right.
I'm working on it, but no. I mean,
Yeah, I do.
what I mean.
For
I
the most
have
part of our life. Yeah.
in my life, I've been lucky enough, and I have to ask myself, why don't I trust people more? Because for the most part, most people have been good to me.
Right. All right. Well, should we do a blessing? Anybody who's listening to this, thank you for trying this out with us, and may the peace of the Lord be with you and everything that we do, so that we might have the grace to learn how to deal with our fear. Cool.
Cool. Amen.
See you, Pastor.
All right.